invited her to outshine me.
Isabella! I didn't know she will come!
Elena had always believed in quiet dreams. She wasn't the kind of woman who made a scene when she entered a room. Instead, she carried a calmness about her, something that drew people in without her even realizing it. Born and raised in Verona, she spent her early years surrounded by cobblestone streets, gelato stands, and the constant hum of tourists marveling at Juliet's balcony. At 21, she moved to Milan to study literature at university. Milan felt like another world entirely, fast, loud, ambitious. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry, chasing money, fashion, or status. Elena, with her notebooks filled with poetry, often felt out of place. It was during her second year that she met Marco. The university library was unusually crowded that rainy afternoon. Students huddled around long wooden tables, laptops open, papers scattered. Elena had found a corner seat near the window, watching the rain blur the city skyline when a tall, dark-haired man dropped a pile of architecture textbooks on the table across from her. "Scusa, is this seat taken?" he asked, his Italian accent warm but hurried. Elena shook her head. "No, please. Go ahead." Marco smiled, sliding into the chair. His hands were rough from hours of sketching models and carrying equipment, but his voice carried an easy confidence. He had dreams in his eyes, the kind of dreams that made him talk about designing skyscrapers in Dubai or restoring ancient cathedrals in Rome. They struck up a conversation almost immediately. Elena admitted she was struggling to finish a paper on Dante's Divine Comedy, and Marco teased her. "Architecture is easier," he said with a grin. She raised an eyebrow. "Really? Tell that to your stack of textbooks." They laughed, and for Elena, it was the first time in months that she felt at ease in Milan. Over the following weeks, they kept running into each other. At the cafe near campus, at the tram stop, even once in the park where Elena went to clear her head. Eventually, Marco asked her to join him for an exhibition of architectural models at the university. That evening, walking together through the streets of Milan lit with golden lamplight, Elena realized she was falling for him. Marco wasn't just ambitious, he was charming, witty, and spoke of the future with such fire that she couldn't help but be drawn in. By spring, they were inseparable. Marco would sit in the cafe while Elena scribbled in her notebook, sketching building designs on napkins. She would read her poetry to him, and he would listen as though every word mattered. One night, sitting by the Navigli canals, Marco turned to her and said, "Elena, when I make it big, I'll build us a house by the water. A house full of light, where you can write your books and I can draw my buildings. We'll live like kings and queens." She laughed, leaning on his shoulder. "I don't need a palace, Marco. I just need you." 2 years later, against her parents' cautious advice, Elena married Marco. The ceremony was small, just a few close friends and family at a quiet chapel. She wore a simple lace dress, and he wore a navy suit that didn't quite fit, but in their eyes, they were starting a fairy tale. The early years were sweet but hard. They lived in a modest one-bedroom flat with a leaky roof. Marco struggled to land clients as a new architect, often taking on odd jobs to make ends meet. Elena, having graduated, took up teaching part-time at a language school and spent her evenings writing short stories no one seemed to notice. Still, they had each other. On Sundays, when they couldn't afford to dine out, they would picnic in the park with bread, cheese, and cheap wine, pretending it was a feast. Marco always promised, "One day, Elena, we'll look back on this and laugh. One day, I'll give you everything you deserve." Life changed dramatically when Elena found out she was pregnant. She had expected one baby, but the doctor's smile turned into surprise as he pointed at the ultrasound screen. "Congratulations," he said, "you're expecting 3. 3? Elena gasped, clutching Marco's arm. 3 blessings, Marco whispered, though his voice trembled with both joy and fear. The pregnancy was difficult, but Elena endured. When the triplets, Matteo, Luca, and Sofia, were born, their tiny cries filled the hospital room, and tears streamed down Marco's face. "We're rich already," he said, holding them close. For Elena, those were the happiest days of her life. Exhausting, yes, but filled with love. She stayed up through sleepless nights, feeding 3 babies in rotation, while Marco tried to keep the bills paid. They were young parents, drowning at times, but still holding hands. But as the years passed, their fairy tale began to crack. Marco's architectural firm struggled. Larger companies won contracts, leaving him with scraps of projects that barely covered expenses. Debt piled up. He grew restless, comparing himself to his peers who drove expensive cars and traveled for work. Elena noticed the change. He became quieter, often brooding late into the night, staring at unpaid bills. "Marco," she whispered once as they lay in bed, "we'll get through this. We've survived worse." He sighed, staring at the ceiling. "Maybe you're used to this life, Elena. But I want more." Her heart sank at the words, but she stayed silent. She loved him still, and she believed their love could weather anything. What Elena didn't realize was that Marco had already started resenting her sacrifices. In his eyes, she was no longer the carefree student who laughed at his dreams. She had become the tired mother of 3, with little time for romance, and in his bitterness, he blamed her for the life they had. The seeds of their unraveling had been planted. And though Elena still looked at Marco as the man who had once promised her a house full of light, Marco now saw only shadows of disappointment. The beginning of their love story, once so sweet, was slowly turning into the beginning of her greatest trial. The triplets had just turned 5 when the tension in Elena and Marco's marriage reached its breaking point. Their small flat in Milan, once alive with laughter and bedtime stories, had grown heavy with silence. Marco stayed out late more often, claiming he was networking with clients, but Elena knew the truth. Most of those nights were spent drowning in frustration at local bars. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter like unwelcome guests. Elena tried to keep things afloat by working extra hours at the language school and editing manuscripts for aspiring writers online. Her evenings were spent grading papers while the children played in the next room. But Marco only grew colder. One evening, Elena set the table with simple pasta and bread. The children sat chattering, their voices bright against the gloom. "Papa, today I drew a tower," Luca said proudly, showing Marco his paper. Marco glanced at it briefly, then pushed the plate of pasta away. "Again with towers? Do you think towers put food on this table?" The boy's face fell. "Marco," Elena said softly, "don't be harsh. He just wants to show you what he learned." Marco's voice rose, sharp as broken glass. "What I've learned, Elena, is that dreams don't pay rent. And maybe I've been dreaming with the wrong person beside me." The words hung in the air like smoke. The children froze. Elena's heart clenched, but she said nothing. Conversations turned to blame. The arguments became more frequent. "You're always tired, always busy with those children," Marco snapped one night. Elena stared at him in disbelief. "Those children are ours, Marco. You think they raise themselves?" He paced the room, his hands raking through his hair. "You don't understand. My colleagues are building real firms, winning contracts. And me? I'm stuck in this flat, with 3 mouths to feed and a wife who spends her life correcting essays." Tears burned Elena's eyes. "I work because you can't carry this alone. I've given everything, Marco. My time, my youth, my body, for you, for this family. Is that not enough?" But his silence answered louder than words. It was a cold December evening when Marco finally made his decision. Snowflakes drifted past the window as Elena prepared the children for bed. Marco stood by the door, his suitcase half-packed. Elena turned, her hands trembling. "Marco? What are you doing?" "I can't do this anymore," he said flatly. "I'm leaving." Her knees nearly buckled. "Leaving? Just like that?" He didn't meet her eyes. "You've become a weight, Elena. I need freedom. I need a chance to live the life I want. Maybe with someone who actually believes in me." Her voice cracked. "I believed in you when no one else did. When you had nothing, I stood by you. And now, when things are hard, you abandon me?" Marco's jaw tightened. "You wouldn't understand. Isabella does." The name hit her like a stone. Isabella, a wealthy businesswoman Marco had met at an architecture conference. Elena had suspected something, but hearing it confirmed was a blade through her chest. "You're leaving me for her?" Elena whispered. "For a chance at a better life," he muttered. "And I don't want a fight. I'll send the papers tomorrow." True to his word, the papers arrived. Elena sat at the kitchen table, staring at them through a blur of tears. The children played quietly in the living room, unaware that their world was collapsing. When Marco came by for her signature, he avoided the children's eyes. Elena, her face pale but composed, confronted him. "Marco, do you realize what you're doing? You're not just divorcing me. You're walking away from them too." He shifted uncomfortably. "I'll send money when I can." "Money?" Her voice broke. "They don't need just money. They need a father." His silence was the final betrayal. "They don't need just money. They need a father." His silence was the final betrayal. With shaking hands, Elena picked up the pen. She paused, staring at the man she had once loved with every fiber of her being. "One day, Marco," she whispered, "you will regret this. Not because of me, but because of what you're throwing away." She signed. That night, after putting the children to bed, Elena sat alone by the window. The snow outside glittered under the street lamps, mocking her loneliness. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let the tears fall freely. She had given Marco everything, her youth, her devotion, her endless support. And in return, he had left her with nothing but 3 children and a broken heart. Yet, even in her grief, a fire began to burn within her. She remembered her father's words long ago, "Elena, life doesn't break strong women. It only bends them until they rise again." She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but deep inside, Elena made a silent vow: she would rebuild. Not for Marco, not even for herself, but for Matteo, Luca, and Sofia. Across town, Marco was celebrating his freedom with Isabella in a glittering restaurant. Crystal chandeliers reflected in his wine glass, but as he laughed too loudly at Isabella's jokes, he felt a pang deep inside. For just a second, he saw Elena's face in his mind, the woman who had once patched his shirts, whispered encouragements, and believed in his wildest dreams. He pushed the thought away, burying it under forced laughter. But life has a way of remembering what we forget. And while Marco thought he had gained the world, he had, in truth, lost the greatest treasure he would ever have. The weeks after Marco's departure were some of the darkest days of Elena's life. The apartment felt colder, emptier. His shoes no longer sat by the door, his laughter no longer echoed down the hall. But the silence was louder than his presence had ever been in those final months. The triplets, Matteo, Luca, and Sofia, didn't fully understand what had happened. Matteo, the most curious of the 3, asked one night, "Mama, when is Papa coming back?" Elena swallowed hard, fighting tears. "Papa has gone to live somewhere else, darling. But Mama is here. Always. She tucked them into bed, kissed their foreheads, and only when the lights were out did she allow herself to cry. Life became a relentless routine. Elena worked long hours at the language school, often picking up extra classes when other teachers fell sick. At night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, editing manuscripts for clients she found online. The bills still seemed endless. Electricity, rent, groceries, school supplies. There were nights she went without dinner so the children could have more. Her hands grew rough from scrubbing floors, her eyes heavy from lack of sleep, but her determination never wavered. Her parents, still in Verona, offered to help, but pride held her back. "I can manage," she insisted, even when her mother begged, "Elena, you don't have to do this alone." Deep inside, Elena knew she did have to do it alone. She needed to prove, if only to herself, that Marco's abandonment would not define her. One rainy night, exhausted after putting the children to bed, Elena opened her laptop to check her freelance inbox. Among the usual small editing jobs, one message stood out. It was from a London-based magazine editor named Charlotte. "Dear Elena," the email began, "I came across your blog. Your piece on motherhood and resilience moved me deeply. Have you considered writing for publication?" Elena blinked in shock. The blog was something she had started quietly, a private place to pour her pain and hope. She never thought anyone important would read it. With trembling hands, she replied, thanking Charlotte and agreeing to submit an article. That night, despite her exhaustion, she wrote for hours, her words flowing like water from a broken dam. She wrote about love, betrayal, motherhood, and the strength it takes to rebuild when life shatters. A week later, Charlotte responded. "This is beautiful. We'd like to publish it in next month's issue. And, Elena, we'd like more from you." The article, titled "Bending but Not Broken," resonated with readers across Europe. Letters and emails poured in, single mothers thanking her for giving voice to their struggles, young women inspired by her strength, even men who admitted they never understood the quiet sacrifices women made. The small paycheck from the magazine wasn't much, but it was a start. More importantly, it was a sign, her voice mattered. With encouragement from Charlotte, Elena began writing more. Soon she was contributing to multiple publications, sometimes articles on motherhood, sometimes short reflective essays. Each piece chipped away at her doubts and added bricks to the foundation of her new life. Through it all, the triplets became her greatest source of strength. Matteo, the dreamer, loved sketching buildings just like his father once did. Luca was practical, always asking questions about how things worked, while Sophia adored reading, often curled up beside Elena with a book far beyond her age. They missed their father, of course, but Elena surrounded them with love. She attended every school play, every sports game, every parent-teacher meeting, even if it meant rushing from work with no time to change clothes. One evening, after she tucked them in, Sophia whispered, "Mama, you're our hero." Elena turned off the light, her eyes stinging with tears. In that moment, she realized she wasn't just surviving. She was becoming someone stronger than she had ever imagined. 2 years after the divorce, Charlotte encouraged Elena to write a book. "Your story, Elena. Not just articles. A book that will inspire women everywhere." At first, Elena laughed at the idea. "A book? Who would want to read about me?" But Charlotte insisted. And slowly, Elena began to write. She wrote late at night, pouring her soul onto the pages, her love story with Marco, the betrayal, the sleepless nights with triplets, the crushing weight of abandonment, and the fire that kept her moving. The manuscript took nearly a year. When she finally submitted it, she braced herself for rejection. Instead, she received a call from the publisher. "Elena, your book is powerful. We want to publish it immediately." With the book deal came new opportunities. Elena realized that if she truly wanted a fresh start, she needed to leave Milan, the city where every street corner reminded her of Marco. When her publisher offered to relocate her to London to work more closely with their editorial team, she accepted. The move was daunting. New city, new culture, new everything. But as the airplane touched down at Heathrow with her children beside her, Elena felt a sense of liberation. This wasn't running away. This was rising again. A glimpse of the future. In London, her book launch exceeded all expectations. The hall was packed, her words quoted in newspapers, her story translated into different languages. Strangers approached her in tears, thanking her for giving them courage. Elena stood on that stage, the triplets smiling proudly in the front row, and she realized, the woman Marco had once called a burden had become a voice for thousands. And deep inside, she knew, this was only the beginning. Have you subscribed yet? Please do so you don't miss any of our beautiful stories of triumph. Marco leaned back in his leather chair, sipping champagne as the city lights of Milan twinkled through the glass walls of Isabella's penthouse. The man who once sulked in a cramped apartment with unpaid bills was now surrounded by luxury, Italian marble floors, designer furniture, a view that stretched across the glittering skyline. Beside him, Isabella moved with the confidence of a woman who had always known wealth. She was older than Marco, elegant, and sharp as a blade. She ran her family's import business, her name whispered in Milanese society circles with respect and sometimes fear. To Marco, she was everything Elena wasn't, glamorous, powerful, untouchable. And yet, deep inside, there lingered a whisper of doubt. At first, being with Isabella felt intoxicating. The dinners at Michelin-star restaurants, the weekend trips to Lake Como, the introductions to wealthy clients, Marco finally felt like he belonged in the world he had always envied. But behind the glamour was a man still haunted by failure. His architecture career had not suddenly flourished, in truth, he had piggybacked on Isabella's connections, securing projects through her influence. He told himself it didn't matter, that success was success, no matter how it came. Still, every now and then, when he caught sight of an old classmate who had succeeded on merit, shame pricked at him like a thorn he couldn't quite pull out. Elena rarely crossed his mind, or so he claimed. When she did, he pictured her struggling in that dingy apartment, exhausted and weighed down by 3 children. He comforted himself with that image, using it as proof that he had made the right choice. But one evening, while scrolling idly through his phone, Marco stumbled upon something unexpected. A friend had shared a link to an article, "Single Mother's Story of Resilience Inspires Thousands." There, staring back at him from the glossy photo, was Elena. She looked different, still modestly dressed, but her eyes were steady, her smile quiet yet powerful. The article mentioned her book, the success of her writing, and even hinted at her move to London. Marco's chest tightened. He closed the link quickly, tossing his phone aside. But the words lingered. Could it be true? Could Elena, his Elena, the woman he had dismissed as a burden, actually be thriving without him? The thought unsettled him. And though he laughed it off to Isabella later that night, deep inside, his pride began to fester. Months later, Marco proposed to Isabella in dramatic fashion, on a yacht in Capri, surrounded by roses and champagne. Isabella, used to such grand gestures, accepted with a smile that was more calculating than romantic. For her, Marco was a charming companion, handsome enough to parade at social events, and ambitious enough to be useful. The engagement was splashed across society pages. Business heiress Isabella Rinaldi to wed architect Marco Bellini. Marco basked in the attention, finally feeling like he had arrived. As wedding preparations began, Marco found himself restless. It wasn't enough to be successful, he wanted the world, and Elena, to see his success. One afternoon, while discussing the guest list with Isabella, Marco casually mentioned, "Maybe I should invite Elena." Isabella raised a perfectly sculpted brow. "Your ex-wife?" Why? He smirked, swirling his wine glass. Why not? Let her see what she lost. Imagine her face, walking into the villa and realizing the kind of life she could have had if she hadn't dragged me down. Isabella chuckled, a cold, dismissive sound. You're cruel, Marco. Not cruel, he corrected, his eyes gleaming. Just poetic. Isabella shrugged. Very well. Invite her, if you wish. It will make no difference to me. Just remember, people like her don't belong in our world anymore. Marco grinned. Exactly. The invitation itself was a masterpiece, ivory cardstock embossed with gold lettering, sealed with the Rinaldi family crest. Marco took special care to address Elena's envelope himself, his handwriting sharp and deliberate. When he dropped it in the post, he felt a rush of satisfaction. He imagined her opening it in some tiny, cluttered kitchen, her hands trembling as she read about his grand new life. In his mind, she would arrive at the wedding in something plain, perhaps with the children tugging at her worn dress. The guests would whisper, comparing her shabby presents to Isabella's radiance. Marco pictured himself standing tall, introducing her as, my ex-wife, with a condescending smile. The fantasy filled him with pride. It wasn't enough that he had left Elena, he needed to prove she had lost, and he had won. In London, Elena found the envelope waiting in her mailbox one chilly morning. She frowned at the familiar handwriting before sliding a finger under the seal. Her eyes scanned the words, Mr. Marco Bellini and Ms. Isabella Rinaldi request the honor of your presence. For a moment, her breath caught. Memories of their wedding, so humble, so full of hope, flashed before her eyes. The irony stung. She set the invitation on the table and stared at it for a long time. Part of her wanted to tear it to shreds, to throw it into the fire and erase the insult. But another part of her, calmer and stronger, whispered, go. Not for him. For you. When the triplets came home from school, Matteo spotted the card. Mama, what's that? Elena smiled faintly. An invitation. To a wedding. Are we going? Sophia asked, her eyes wide. Elena looked at her children, the living proof of everything Marco had abandoned, and felt a surge of resolve. Yes, she said softly. We're going. Foreshadowing. That night, as she tucked the invitation into a drawer, Elena whispered a quiet prayer, not for revenge, but for strength. She knew Marco's intentions. She knew the humiliation he hoped for. But what Marco didn't know was that Elena was no longer the broken woman he had left behind. She was stronger, wiser, and far more radiant than he could imagine. And when she arrived at that villa, it would not be she who bore the weight of shame. It would be him. The wedding villa shimmered in the late afternoon sun, its Renaissance arches draped with white roses and silver ribbons. A string quartet played near the fountain, their notes floating through the manicured gardens. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled, sipping champagne beneath chandeliers strung from ancient olive trees. It was a spectacle worthy of the Rinaldi name. And Marco, standing tall at the altar in his custom Armani tuxedo, felt like the crown jewel of the day. He scanned the crowd with a practiced smile, his pride swelling. Soon, Isabella would walk down the aisle, and with her on his arm, his transformation would be complete. But there was one more piece to his performance. The thought of Elena made him smirk. He imagined her slipping quietly into the back row, perhaps wearing one of her modest dresses. Maybe she would try to blend into the shadows, ashamed of the contrast. He could already hear the whispers, that's the ex-wife? How plain she looks. How unfortunate. Yes, today would be perfect. Just as the ushers guided the final guests to their seats, the distant purr of an engine drew heads toward the gravel driveway. At first it was faint, but as the vehicle approached, the sound deepened into a rich, resonant growl, the kind only a limousine could produce. Conversations faltered. Glasses froze mid-air. The quartet stumbled to a halt as eyes shifted toward the villa gates. And then it appeared. A white limousine, polished to a mirror sheen, glided up the driveway with regal grace. Sunlight danced across its chrome grille, and the spirit of ecstasy hood ornament gleamed like a jewel. The car seemed to float, its presence both commanding and effortless, as if the very air around it parted in reverence. The murmurs began immediately. Is that a limousine? Who on earth would arrive in such a car? Is it one of Isabella's society friends? Marco stiffened, his smile faltering. He hadn't arranged this. The door opens. The chauffeur, dressed in immaculate black, stepped out and walked with crisp precision to the rear door. He pulled it open with a gloved hand. And from the limousine emerged Elena. She wore a gown the color of midnight, flowing silk that shimmered with every step. The dress hugged her figure with effortless elegance, its simplicity highlighting rather than overshadowing her natural grace. Her hair, once hurriedly pinned back during their married years, now cascaded in soft waves. Around her neck glinted a single pearl pendant, understated, but radiant. Gasps rippled through the crowd. That's her? The ex-wife? She's stunning. She looks like royalty. Elena paused for a moment, letting her gaze sweep across the villa, the crowd, the altar. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her chin lifted, her posture regal. She was no longer the weary woman Marco had abandoned, she was transformed. And then, just as the whispers peaked, 3 smaller figures stepped out of the car behind her. The triplets. Matteo, in a crisp navy suit, walked with the same steady stride as his mother. Sophia, wearing a pale lavender dress, clutched her small silver purse with practiced elegance. Luca, in matching navy, adjusted his tiny bow tie with all the seriousness of a gentleman. The crowd melted. Oh, my goodness, look at them. Are those her children? Triplets? How beautiful. The children's presence was like sunlight breaking through clouds. They were polished yet natural, exuding the same quiet dignity Elena did. Each held themselves with a confidence that belied their age. The chauffeur closed the phantom's door and followed discreetly, leaving Elena and her children to walk down the villa's pathway, every guest's eyes locked on them. At the altar, Marco's throat tightened. His jaw slackened as he stared. This wasn't the picture he had rehearsed. This wasn't a woman defeated. Elena glided forward, her hand gently resting on Sophia's shoulder, her sons flanking her like young princes. She smiled, not arrogantly, but serenely, the kind of smile that needed no words to proclaim victory. Marco felt the burn of humiliation crawl up his neck. He glanced at Isabella, but she had fixed her gaze on Elena with narrowed eyes, her lips pressed in a thin line. Even Isabella, the unshakable heiress, seemed unsettled. As Elena and her children moved among the guests, people parted instinctively, giving them space as though royalty had entered the room. Compliments floated toward her. You look divine, Signora. The children are remarkable. Such elegance. Elena responded with warmth, her voice calm, her laughter light. She was approachable yet untouchable, a paradox that only made her more magnetic. Marco's chest clenched. This was supposed to be his stage, his triumph. But now, every eye was on her. Finally, Elena reached the front rows. She paused, just a few steps from the altar. For a brief moment, the world seemed to still, the music, the murmurs, even the breeze quieted. Her eyes met Marco's. It wasn't anger she carried in her gaze, nor bitterness. It was something far more devastating, pity. A look that said, without words, I survived you. I thrived without you. And now, you are the one exposed. Marco's chest tightened as if invisible hands were squeezing his lungs. He tried to muster a smirk, to reclaim some control, but his lips quivered instead. Whispers spread like wildfire among the guests. She outshines even the bride. Do you see how Marco looks at her? As if he didn't expect this. She's triumphant, and he didn't even know it. The humiliation Marco had planned for Elena had reversed. Every smile, every glance, every whisper was a mirror reflecting his pettiness, his arrogance, his failure to see her worth. Elena guided her children to their seats, unhurried, graceful. She sat tall, folding her hands neatly in her lap. She had no need for grand gestures. No need for revenge. Her very presence was enough. The Rolls-Royce, the children, the elegance, they spoke louder than any words could. Marco turned his eyes away, unable to bear the truth. He had hoped to bury her under shame. Instead, he stood at his own wedding, exposed before his bride, his guests, and himself. The man who had sought to disgrace his ex-wife now stood disgraced in her shadow. And the wedding had only just begun. The villa's courtyard, once filled with the carefree hum of celebration, now buzzed with an undercurrent of unease. The quartet resumed their music, but the notes faltered, offbeat and tentative, as though even the musicians were distracted by Elena's arrival. The bride had not yet walked down the aisle. Still, it already felt as though the ceremony had been hijacked by an uninvited queen. Elena sat in the second row, her posture impeccable, her triplets settled gracefully beside her. The limousine gleamed in the distance, its presence a silent sentinel of her triumph. Guests stole glances at her, unable to resist. Women admired her poise, whispering about her gown and wondering how she had transformed so elegantly. Men, even those loyal to Isabella, couldn't deny her magnetic presence. And though Elena kept her eyes fixed serenely on the altar, Marco could feel the weight of her existence pressing against him like an unbearable spotlight. Inside the villa, Isabella prepared for her grand entrance. Her gown, an intricate masterpiece of lace and diamonds, sparkled beneath the chandeliers. Two bridesmaids fussed over her veil while her father adjusted his cufflinks. But Isabella noticed the shift in atmosphere the moment she stepped toward the doorway. The murmur of the crowd wasn't the expectant buzz reserved for a bride, it was the hum of curiosity, admiration, and scandal. As she peered through the archway, her gaze fell on Elena. For a fleeting second, Isabella's smile cracked. The ex-wife. The woman she had been warned about in hushed tones. Instead of a faded shadow, Elena sat like a rival queen in her court. Worse, she had brought 3 children, each dressed like heirs to a legacy Isabella could never touch. Isabella's jaw tightened. Her grip on her bouquet left a faint imprint in the petals. This was supposed to be her day. Marco felt the sweat bead at his temples. He forced a smile at the priest, at the guests, at no one in particular. His charm, the tool he had wielded for years, was suddenly clumsy, brittle, almost desperate. He caught Isabella's eye as she began her walk down the aisle. He widened his smile, as if to say, "Focus on us. Ignore her." But Isabella's eyes flicked coldly toward Elena before returning to her groom. And that flicker was enough. Marco saw it. He felt it like a dagger. The guests rose as Isabella entered, her father escorting her with practiced grandeur. The string quartet steadied, swelling with music. Yet even as Isabella glided down the aisle, whispers followed in her wake. "She's beautiful, but, did you see Elena? The ex-wife outshines the bride. Those children, so striking, so dignified." Isabella heard them. The whispers crawled beneath her skin. She kept her smile frozen, her eyes fixed ahead, but her heart hammered with fury. When Isabella reached the altar, Marco took her hand, kissing it lightly. "You're radiant," he whispered, his smile strained. "Am I?" she murmured back, her eyes cutting briefly toward Elena. "Because half your guests seem to think otherwise." Marco stiffened. "Ignore her. She means nothing." But Isabella saw the flicker in his eyes, the twitch in his jaw. Elena meant something, all right, maybe more than Marco dared admit. The priest cleared his throat and began the traditional vows. His voice echoed through the courtyard, solemn and measured. But focus was impossible. Elena's presence was like a candle in a darkened room. No matter how one tried, eyes were drawn back to her glow. Even the priest, at one point, faltered, his gaze sliding briefly toward the second row before regaining composure. Marco shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar. Isabella's smile thinned with every passing second. By the time the vows reached the midpoint, the atmosphere had curdled. Guests no longer whispered. They exchanged glances openly, some even smiling toward Elena in acknowledgement. A prominent businessman leaned toward his wife and whispered too loudly, "She's remarkable." To think Marco left her. Elena caught the words but gave no reaction. She simply reached for Luca's small hand, holding it gently, her eyes still calm. Isabella, however, heard them too. Her grip on Marco's hand tightened like a vice. When the priest asked Marco to repeat his vows, his voice cracked. "I, Marco Bellini, take you, Isabella Rinaldi." The words stumbled, hollow. He risked a glance toward Elena, and for a split second, their eyes met. Elena's gaze was steady, unflinching. Not triumphant, not mocking, simply pitying. It broke him. His knees trembled. He rushed through the rest of the vow, his voice flat, almost mechanical. Isabella noticed. Everyone noticed. When it was her turn, Isabella recited her vow with perfect diction, her voice dripping with defiance. Every word was a weapon, not a promise. "I, Isabella Rinaldi, take you, Marco Bellini." Her eyes, however, were not on Marco. They darted repeatedly toward Elena, sharp as daggers, as if she were vowing to outshine the ex-wife, not to love her groom. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. This was no longer a wedding, it was a duel, a silent war fought with glances and unspoken truths. At last, the priest declared, "You may now kiss the bride." Marco leaned forward, but Isabella turned her head slightly, forcing his lips to brush her cheek instead of her mouth. A collective murmur rippled through the courtyard. Marco froze. Isabella forced a brittle laugh, tilting her face for a quick peck on the lips, but the damage was done. The kiss wasn't love. It was theater, and the audience knew it. Through it all, Elena sat composed, her children watching in innocent curiosity. She had no need to gloat, no need to whisper. Her silence was louder than any words could be. As applause broke out for the newlyweds, it was perfunctory, half-hearted. The real energy, the real admiration, lingered in the second row, where a woman once discarded now shone brighter than both bride and groom. And Marco knew it. Isabella knew it. Everyone knew it. The wedding was unraveling. Is there anyone you think will be encouraged by this story? Please like and share this story to encourage more people. The sun had begun its slow descent over the Tuscan hills, painting the villa's gardens in hues of amber and rose. The ceremony was over, but instead of relief, the air buzzed with unease. The newlyweds had said their vows, yet the whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown sharper, louder, more brazen. The courtyard was transformed into a banquet space, with long tables adorned with crystal, silver cutlery, and centerpieces of cascading orchids. Guests carried glasses of champagne, laughing too loudly, trying to restore a sense of normalcy. But normalcy was gone. The phantom of Elena's presence lingered at every table, in every whispered conversation, in every sideways glance. Isabella and Marco entered the reception to polite applause. Marco's arm was looped around his bride's, but his posture was stiff, his smile taut. Isabella, though radiant in her jeweled gown, walked with an edge of defiance, her chin high, her eyes glittering with something darker than joy. Across the courtyard, Elena stood briefly to adjust Sophia's dress, then sat again, calm and graceful. She didn't rise to meet the applause. She didn't need to. Half the guests looked at the couple. The other half looked at her. Isabella's father rose first, lifting his glass. To my daughter Isabella, and to Marco, may your union be blessed with prosperity and longevity. There was clinking of glasses, murmurs of agreement, a smattering of applause. But as he spoke, his eyes lingered for a beat too long on Elena. And when he sat down, more than one guest whispered about the subtle shift in his tone, a blessing that sounded more like diplomacy than genuine joy. As the courses were served, truffle risotto, roasted lamb, and tiramisu, the attention of the guests drifted between the bridal table and the second row where Elena sat. She conversed easily with those nearby, her laughter light, her children's manners impeccable. The triplets drew admiration from strangers who leaned in to chat with them. Matteo spoke confidently about his love for football. Sophia charmed the women with her wide-eyed curiosity about the decor. Luca recited a poem he had learned in school, earning soft applause. They're remarkable children, a guest remarked aloud. Elena has raised them beautifully, another added. Marco heard it. Every word was another crack in the fragile mask of his pride. When it was Marco's turn to speak, he rose slowly, glass in hand. His voice faltered. He cleared his throat. I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate with us. Isabella and I are honored. He paused, his eyes sweeping the crowd. Too many gazes darted away, sliding instead toward Elena. Something inside him twisted. He forced a smile, continuing. Marriage is about new beginnings, about finding the person who completes you. Isabella has given me strength, support, and... His voice caught again. He made the mistake of glancing at Elena. She wasn't staring at him, she was helping Luca cut his lamb into smaller pieces, her expression soft and maternal. But the sight pierced him. For a moment, Marco forgot his rehearsed lines. The silence dragged. A few polite coughs broke it. He stumbled through the rest, sitting down quickly. The applause was polite but muted, the kind one gives out of obligation, not admiration. Isabella's lips curled into a tight smile, but her eyes burned. As the applause died, she leaned close to Marco, her voice a hiss only he could hear. Pathetic. You can't even speak without looking at her. Marco stiffened. That's not true. Don't lie to me, she snapped. Her gaze darted again toward Elena, who now listened attentively as a group of guests gathered around her. She's stealing this wedding right out from under me, and you're letting her. Marco's chest tightened. He wanted to protest, but no words came. Midway through the evening, Isabella's mother rose unexpectedly, her jeweled hand resting on her glass. To Isabella, she began, her voice elegant but sharp. You have always been the jewel of our family, and today you shine brighter than ever. And to Marco, she paused, her eyes flicking toward Elena. May you prove yourself worthy of what you've been given. The words hung heavy. Half the guests nodded in approval, the other half traded knowing glances. Marco's face flushed crimson. Isabella's hand clenched her glass so tightly the stem nearly snapped. Elena, however, remained serene, simply sipping her water. She needed no defense, others delivered it for her. As the desserts were cleared, Matteo excused himself to use the restroom. On his way back, one of the guests stopped him. Matteo, you look just like your mother, the woman cooed. Do you write, too? Matteo smiled shyly. Mama says I have a good imagination. Sophia, overhearing, piped up, we're writing a story together. About 3 explorers who never give up. The table laughed warmly, charmed. Even Luca added, Mama says the best treasures are found when you keep walking. It was innocent, childlike, but to the crowd, it was profound. Guests clapped softly, touched by their words. And to Marco, it was crushing. His children, his legacy, stood as living proof of the woman he had discarded. They were articulate, confident, and admired. In their presence, his own achievements felt shallow. Toward the end of the evening, an elderly professor, a longtime friend of the Rinaldi family, rose for the final toast. I have attended many weddings, he said, his voice steady and wise. But rarely have I seen such contrasts. Today we celebrate union, yet we are reminded of resilience, dignity, and grace. His eyes lingered openly on Elena. True strength is not in the wealth we marry into, but in the lives we build when everything seems lost. The courtyard fell silent. His words were not a toast to Marco and Isabella, they were a tribute to Elena. Glasses clinked half-heartedly, but all eyes returned to the second row. Marco sat rigid, his fists clenched beneath the table. He could feel the humiliation burning through him, heavier than the weight of the tuxedo on his shoulders. This was supposed to be his moment, his revenge, his victory. Instead, his ex-wife had said nothing, done nothing, and yet she had stolen everything. His bride was furious. His in-laws were skeptical. His guests were enthralled by Elena and her children. And deep in his chest, Marco knew the truth, he hadn't won. He had lost, long ago, the day he abandoned the only person who had ever truly believed in him. As the evening wound down, Elena rose with her children. She thanked the guests graciously, accepted compliments with humility, and walked with steady grace back to the waiting limousine. No gloating. No grand speech. Just quiet dignity. The sight of her retreating figure, flanked by her children, was more powerful than any victory lap. She didn't need to stay and bask in the whispers. She had made her point simply by being there. The limousine's door closed with a soft click. The car glided away, leaving silence in its wake. And in that silence, Marco's wedding, his supposed triumph, lay in ruins. The hall felt colder after her departure. Conversations resumed, but they were empty, strained. Many guests found excuses to leave early. Business partners shook hands with stiff smiles, their eyes avoiding Marco's. The weight of judgment pressed down on him, suffocating. When at last the music died and the hall emptied, Marco sat alone at the head table, staring at the remnants of a feast that no longer tasted sweet. Isabella had retreated to her bridal suite, refusing to face the whispers. He buried his face in his hands, his chest hollow. All his triumph, all his arrogance, had led him here, a hollow marriage, a broken reputation, and the haunting memory of a woman he could never reclaim. For years, he had thought leaving Elena made him stronger, freer. But now he saw the truth. His pride had destroyed him. And somewhere, out there, Elena was moving forward, stronger, radiant, unbroken. Marco's tragedy was not that Elena had left him behind. It was that she had risen while he remained trapped in the ruins of his choices. And as the limousine carried her into the future, Marco was left with the echo of what could have been, and the bitter taste of a victory that had turned into his greatest defeat. Thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe for more interesting stories to come.